Hello and welcome to the Media Center's series of Local Heroes, in which we showcase a total of 6 people from Atherton, East Palo Alto, Menlo Park, and Stanford for outstanding achievement or contributions to the community. We solicited nominations and we're particularly looking for the unsung heroes. Each winner is an inspiration and each has a great story to tell. We're here in downtown Menlo Park at Cafe Baroni, right next to Kepler's, both of which, as I'm sure you know, are local heroes in their own rights. And we'd like to thank Baroni's for having us. Betty Gerard is a volunteer in Joe Simitian's office. She first became interested in politics when she was one of only a handful of women at Northwestern University's prestigious School of Journalism. Since then, her journalist's eye, ear, and pen have touched everything she's done. Betty, thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Congratulations on your award. Why Joe Simitian's office and why volunteer?
Well, I actually sort of stumbled into working for Joe, whom I had admired and voted for. He's had a series of, he's been at city council, school board, county supervisor, and then assemblyman, and now senator. So I was doing publicity for the League of Women Voters on their meeting, a kickoff meeting, that he was the speaker. And I thought, I think I'd like to know a little bit more about his background and what his committees are and so forth for this press release. And went in, and his district office manager at that time said, how would you like to be a volunteer for Joe? So that was in 2002. And I've been there ever since, a couple of days a week, not every day.
What are the things that really stand out for you about Joe?
Well, his beliefs are compatible with mine in terms of education and the environment, and generally enlightened. I would describe him as enlightened policies. You know, he's a good man. Mm-hmm. So one of the things he does is an outreach to nonprofits. He has always had one of his staffers who makes a point of becoming familiar with the nonprofits. He covers now San Mateo, Santa Clara counties, and he also now has added Santa Cruz County. So it's been amazing to see the over 8,000 nonprofits just in San Mateo and Santa Clara County. Wow. The tremendous numbers of people giving very generously of their time, volunteer effort, money to support them. So that's a very special American kind of thing, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I
volunteerism.
Guess so.
Many countries don't have that.
What do you actually do? From what I gather, you do a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff that just nobody knows,
supportive, yeah.
But it makes it all work.
Well, he has a number of college and high school interns who come in and also are contributing time, you know, and a former school superintendent who's very knowledgeable about education, who, like me, spends several days a week in the office.
But you bring a lot of your journalism skills to what you do.
Well, I tend to be working with words, doing like for his Ought to Be a Law contest that he runs every year. I boil down the 250 entries each into a little summary, and they differ. Some people just scratch out an idea that they think there should be a law in a sentence or two, and other people submit a binder, you know. So it's a matter of, because Joe looks at all of them, and his staff people also pick out the ones they think have the most merit, and of course they have to check what is now legislation so that they're not reinventing the wheel, you know.
Just to summarize, in case people don't know, he does have this program.
It's called Ought to Be a Law, and
right.
It's annual, and people just say what they feel needs to be corrected by the legislature, and he's gotten about 10 of them actually have become law, been signed by the respective governor, you know. In a way for the public to actually, not the interest groups, but the average guy who has an idea that something needs to be corrected.
There ought to be a law.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What have you learned about politics and about your community from this experience?
That's a provocative question. I think simply, one of the things I do too is to go through the nonprofit publications to find what one is doing that might be of interest to another. In other words, maybe a guidebook or a training session or something, and have really been astounded at all of the good works that are going on, you know, quietly. I feel I really feel that my being interviewed is just that there are literally hundreds of people that you could be talking to who are doing far more for the community than I am. I tend to work with words, do publicity for like Neighbors Abroad and our sister city group, and the Palo Alto Historical Association, and World Affairs Council, and the League. I've just started with the League of Women Voters doing their publicity. All of these are
that's a
good
lot.
Causes.
Those are a lot.
Yeah. And for Joe, in addition to these little projects that I've mentioned, he's fortunately very articulate on his feet. He doesn't need a speechwriter. But sometimes he wants somebody to dig up some research material, like I dug into the differences between the electronic voting equipment, for example. Something where it's helpful to him to kind of get a quick background on it. And so, you know, and then occasionally a constituent will write a particularly challenging letter, and that involves going in and finding background information for him, and maybe drafting a possible letter, which he always, you know, works on.
So all that background material all that work is being done by you.
Well,
and others. Right. Now, let's go back a few years to when you were a student. Very few women were in a program like Northwestern's at the time.
Yeah, I'm old. I'm 81, and at the time that I was coming out of college in 1946 at the University of Washington, my friends were all marrying their boyfriends who were back from the service. You know, it was a year that guys in bits and pieces of military uniforms were back on campus and very serious about their education. You know, they'd lost a lot of time. So I went off to work on a master's at Northwestern. I'd been the editor of the College Humor magazine and decided I needed to learn a little bit more about the technical side of the magazine work. And so my friends had no idea what a master's degree was. I mean, they were all busy having babies and furnishing apartments, and you know.
Wow.
And the Northwestern charming dean said to one of us, "Well, frankly, we only accepted 5 women, and we would have preferred to have had none, because they were bucking for a reputation opposite Columbia and Missouri, you know. And women, they figured pretty much correctly in my generation, worked a couple of years and then got married and stayed home with babies, you know."
Well, so what did that kind of experience do to you? Was that a real affront? Did it toughen you up?
I was not a feminist at that point, and one of the guys said to me, "You write like a man," and I considered that a high compliment. I think now the girls would be really
Insulted,
take umbrage, right? But it was a man's world, you know. Women were there on the sufferance of the dean. He would have preferred having just guys, because they would go out and make a career for themselves and bring glory to the university, you know.
Well, among the things you did, among your travels and your various experiences, what were the high points or aha memorable moments?
Well, I worked after various other, you know, when pre-marriage, I did publicity for, I worked for Sunset Magazine and for Westinghouse Electric, doing public relations and so forth. Then I stayed home with the family for 17 years, partially because I didn't know how to drive. So learning to drive kind of freed me up to re-enter the job world, and I I was Pete McCloskey's press secretary, actually for money. It was the first money I'd made in many years. And that was very interesting. There were big-time reporters who came by, and I escorted around and so forth. And I remember submitting a picture we set up of him on a bike talking to a guy with a backpack, kind of an environmental thing. And I serviced it to the AP, and afterward, one of the women said, "Did you notice that his fly was open?" That was a low point.
Yeah, low point.
But during the time I was at HP, had several opportunities to interview Bill Hewlett, and that was memorable. I went to his final interview when he was retiring. He had a press conference, the big time wire services and the LA Times and some of the big papers all wanted interviews with him. He wanted to leave and go skiing at Sun Valley, where he had a place. So he said, well, we'll bring them all in at one time. And because I was running the internal news service for the company, I got to go too. And that was great fun because beforehand, the girl from the LA Times was very, was sort of supercilious, and then at the end of his time with them, she cooed. She said, "Oh, Mr. Hewlett, you're so wonderful. They said that you didn't like to give interviews, but I don't know why. You're just so wonderful." So that was fun. He was a great guy.
It does sound as though you have just kind of surmounted certainly sexism, and you went back out into the working world after bringing up a family, which isn't always easy, and you just have kind of floated easily into these things that are difficult for a lot of people.
I instinctively, I was 49 when I began to try to wiggle back into professional, work. And it was interesting that we'd had an evening business for many years in which my role was very clerical. My husband was a linguist and a chemist, and I couldn't contribute to any of that. I could just type. But it was for 17 years, and then I had this 2.5 months with McCloskey, and this is what people looked at on the resume, not my background. I had perfectly good educational credentials and even some experience, but just the duration of 17 years of grunt labor, plus this kind of, McCloskey was sort of a hero at that time. So
it does sound as though you did a lot of things right, maybe even inadvertently at the time. What sort of advice do you have for women in that role now?
One thing that, because I was interviewing at an older age, which I didn't actually realize was a disadvantage, but it was. So being kind of stupid about it was helpful. So I sailed around with my little samples and feeling I was a good buy for somebody, but not recognizing that the age was a problem, and it is. But I made a little extra effort to showcase myself. I went out on a limb doing proposals, and at Stanford, when it was interviewed for a couple of jobs I didn't get, but in each case I tackled a problem. One was the medical school, and I felt that they needed to reach out more to the community, talking about what they had, and also Stanford in general. Now, you run a risk that these people, because you're clearly kind of naive and don't really understand what they're dealing with, will think that you're just objectionable or something. But it shows a certain willingness to put some intellective effort into analyzing what their needs might be, or as you see them. You stick your neck out, in other words.
Now, you also did, you've done a few things. You had a space in the daily newspaper for a while.
Oh.
And you also had,
well, not a byline, just, that was...
Right. But you also did your own little personal journal based on events you were reading?
Well,
Tell me a couple from either one of those. Maybe one example of a highlight, one that you feel closest to or most proud of.
Well, I began doing these little personal, and they're not published or anything. Maybe my children will enjoy reading them someday. What I call footnotes to the news. When something in the current news reverberated with my background, like when Condoleezza Rice was went with Bush originally. I'd arranged that she be a speaker at Hewlett-Packard because she was then for about a year a trustee, and she came over and talked to our department and government affairs, and she's, as you know, a very electrifying speaker. Yeah. So we had this star talking to us that was fun. And when Chief Justice Bill Rehnquist retired, I remembered a long ago blind date that I'd had arranged by my very lively artist roommate, and her boyfriend, who was also at the Stanford Law School with Rehnquist, who was known to be the best student.
So this was a blind date you had with William Rehnquist.
With Rehnquist. And so it was a pleasant evening with no particular attractions, so that was the end of that. Then when my friend broke up with her boyfriend, it turned out that Rehnquist had always had his eye on this kind of bohemian artist, and he took her out for dinner. And then they got back to the apartment. He said to her legalistically, "Well, enough of this preamble, take off your clothes," which offended her. And it was so funny. You probably can't use that in your interview.
Oh, we'll use it. We'll definitely use it. In fact, that's a good note to end on, because you must have volumes of stories that we hope one day will be published. But in the meantime, we want to thank you very much for all the work you do. And we have a plaque here for you.
Really?
In honor of all your volunteerism in
nice.
Various areas in the community. So thank you.
I do this because I really enjoy it, and one of the first rules of journalism is, Journalism 101 is to stay out of the picture yourself.
Well, now's your one little snapshot.
Thank you very much.
We're here at Cafe Baroni next to Kepler's in downtown Menlo Park. We encourage you to come down and have a cup of coffee, have a lunch, buy a couple books. We'd like to thank Baroni's for having us here, and thank you for